And yes, another portcullis. You can see the grooves. If you do get through this, you're here, you think you're in, but you're not. You're standing underneath the murder hole. People up there chucking things down at you. Rocks to crush your skull, quicklime, which burns your skin and blinds you, and boiling fish oil, which ruins your hair.
Not wanting to ruin his hair, Glyn Dwr decided to lay siege to the castle. But to get in, he needed heavy artillery, so he made a deal with the French, who not only supplied him with 2,500 troops, but gave him some of these.
Ready, loose.
Trebuchets.
Loose.
The trebuchet is a medieval rocket launcher. It takes 5 skilled, strong men to operate. It weighs 3 tons and is made of wood, with a sling woven from hemp. It has a wooden box containing a ton of boulders that drops to the ground, creating the force that shoots the missile.
Loose. On one end is the sling that's attached to the arm, and what that does, in effect, is it lengthens the end of the arm, but without adding any extra weight to it. As the box falls, the short end comes down, the long end travels much, much faster, and the sling then comes out, and that extends the arm even farther. So if the velocity here is, say, 10 metres per second, by the time you get to the other end, it's 150 metres per second.
Owain laid siege to Harlech Castle while the French stopped any supplies reaching them by sea.
Did they shoot anything other than boulders and rocks?
Well, one of the problems with the trebuchet is that despite its huge size, it wasn't massively effective at punching a hole through the curtain walls. So what you could do, though, is you could throw stuff over the wall at the people sheltering within. You could lob things like bags of quicklime, which is a form of like chemical weapon. It causes nasty burns. You could throw the diseased, rotting bodies of dead animals to try and spread pestilence within the garrison. Burning barrels to try and set light to the buildings. The severed heads of captured prisoners to demoralise the people sheltering within. Any sort of really nasty thing you can think of, they probably chucked it with a trebuchet. One more. OK, loose.
For 3 months, the remnants of the English garrison held out against the constant bombardment of the trebuchets and the rising stench of putrid corpses. Eventually, only 20 men were left alive, and they had no choice but to surrender.
Harlech is thought to have fallen on April the 23rd, 1404. Owain was now in complete control of all Wales. This is the Great Hall, where he held Parliament, declared Wales officially free from English rule, and began to set up a fully independent Welsh church. He was even organising a campaign to take him into England to topple Henry IV. Things were going pretty well. But Owain wasn't the only person claiming to be the Prince of Wales. Somebody called Prince Hal, later to be King Henry V, thought he was the Prince of Wales. Now, Prince Hal had cut his teeth doing battle with the Welsh. Literally, in fact. In 1403, he got an arrow in the face, which went in through here and came out here. He was only 15, and it ruined his good looks forever.
Hal returned to Wales 2 years later. His wound had finally healed, but the emotional scar had not. This time it was personal. He began a bloody campaign of revenge, storming through Wales, retaking villages and towns, and butchering the inhabitants. He won his first major victory at Usk, where he captured 300 of Owain's men and slaughtered them all. He also imprisoned Owain's son Griffith and sent him to the Tower of London, where he was tortured mercilessly. One by one, the English took the castles back. Welsh nobles were publicly executed and their bodies displayed across the country as a warning to deter other rebels. After 4 years of bloody warfare, only Harlech Castle still stood against the English, who had reconquered the rest of the country. In July 1407, 1,000 of Prince Hal's men arrived at its walls, ready to unleash hell.
Hal was a great military leader. He'd fought many a battle with Owain, and it all came to a head here at Harlech Castle in 1407. Hal brought to the battlefield his most fearsome weapon, the cannon.
The cannon was a relatively new invention and not always easy to use.
Cannons were dangerous, and not only to the people they were being fired at. The technology was fairly new and often temperamental. The biggest cannon they used was called the King's Daughter. When they tried to fire it, the King's Daughter threw a tantrum, exploded and killed everyone standing nearby. Now, we think these cannonballs were fired by the English into Harlech during the siege to cause damage, chaos, carnage, that sort of thing. But however hard they pounded, the inner castle walls never collapsed. Cannon fire is thought to have caused the destruction of most of this curtain wall here, and the sound of cannonballs pounding against the castle walls must have been terrifying for the people inside.
The siege started in July 1407. In February 1409, it was still going strong. Disease and starvation had killed off most of the men inside, although Owain's family and his close ally, Sir Edward Mortimer, were still alive.
It took nearly a year of sieging before starvation finally made them give up the castle.
Prince Hal charged in triumphantly, keen to meet Glyn Dwr face to face and probably chop his head off. But Owain wasn't there. Legend says that he slipped out of the castle one night before the siege ended, passed through the enemy lines and gave Hal and his troops the slip.
Sir Edmund Mortimer was killed in battle at the castle, and that was pretty much the end of the Great Welsh Uprising.
After 1411, Wales was back under English rule and remained so for almost 600 years to come. Glyn Dwr's family were captured and sent to the Tower. Owain himself headed for the hills, hiding out in caves and avoiding the English, who were very keen to talk to him. After 11 years of brutal and bloodthirsty battles, the Welsh War of Independence finally came to an end. But Owain Glyndwr's name was to become legendary in Wales.
He was never found, but he was never betrayed. Although his rebellion was crushed, as the father of Welsh nationalism, his memory and his spirit will remain forever.
In July 1381, 100,000 peasants went up to London to visit the king. But this was no day trip, it was a revolt. The most violent political protest England has ever seen. Nothing was sacred. Not the king, not the church, not the government. And no one was safe. Human heads became trophies carried before the baying mob.
The peasants wanted freedom from serfdom. They came to the capital prepared to fight to the death to achieve it.
3 days later, London was alight. Palaces were destroyed, churchmen and ministers were executed, and the gutters were filled with blood, guts and heads. This was the peasants' revolt.
In the 1300s, life for the peasants really stunk. Under the feudal system, each peasant was tied to a lord. Some were serfs, little more than slaves, owned by the lord. Others had more rights but still owed the lord's service. While it was tough on the peasants, it was great for the nobles. Owning serfs didn't just make a lord powerful, it made him rich. He could demand fees or fines if they moved away or got married. He could order them to work for nothing a number of days a week. And without the lord's consent, some peasants couldn't mill their own corn, educate their children, or have certain types of haircut. From the bottom of the heap, the peasants reached up to the man at the top for help. Richard II was a scion of the House of Plantagenet.
and God's anointed representative on earth. But he was also a 14-year-old boy, and the peasants thought he might be manipulated by his advisors. This fueled their burning hatred of the nobility. The peasants had slow-burning, deep-seated grievances, but the revolt of 1381 needed a spark to ignite it. That spark was the poll tax. Yes, the peasants' revolt was the first ever poll tax riot, and it was a big one. It made the poll tax riots of 1990 seem like the teddy bear's picnic. The first ever poll tax was introduced in 1377 to pay for the war against France. In 1380, it was levied at 3 groats a person on everyone over the age of 14 except beggars. There was tax evasion on a massive scale, so the government sent out commissioners. When they arrived at Fobbing in Essex in May 1381, there was a riot. The Essex men dealt with the inspectors in the only way they knew how. They beat them to death, beheaded them, and put their heads on sticks, which they carried around like banners. The peasants' revolt had begun. The violence spread like wildfire north through East Anglia and south into Kent. On the first day, 5,000 people were involved in the revolt. Within 2 days, it was 10 times that number, and it kept on growing. The rebels forced their way into manors and towns demanding loyalty. If they didn't get it, they destroyed everything in their path. They burnt the legal documents listing who owned and owed what. They dragged out prominent men and beheaded anyone who wouldn't join them. They killed the clergy and hunted down the lawyers. For a week, the east of England was aflame. They threw open jails, sacked castles, and burnt manor houses to the ground. But if the rebellion was going to achieve more than just destruction, the peasants needed a leader. Sometime during the first 5 days of the revolt, an enigmatic and charismatic figure joined the cause. Wat Tyler. Legend says that Wat joined the campaign when he was interrupted by a tax inspector while tiling a roof. The tax inspector said Wat's daughter was older than 14 and should be paying poll tax. Wat's family said she wasn't. So the tax inspector tried to prove she was by looking up her skirt. This was an outrageous and insulting thing to do. Wat was so incensed, he joined the rebellion immediately. Tyler came from nowhere, yet became one of the most revolutionary figures in English history. But why Wat? And where and how? Well, we don't really know. Nothing survives to explain how an itinerant Tyler could become leader of such an enormous rebellion. We think he may have been a soldier who'd served overseas. He certainly knew how to motivate men. He managed to get a very ordinary bunch of peasants to strike fear into the hearts of the most powerful men in the land. Many serfs had fought as foot soldiers in the wars against France, but they'd never taken on the nobles before. It wasn't a fair fight. The nobles were trained warriors with state-of-the-art weaponry. Tyler's men were labourers, armed with whatever they could scavenge. What's this log?
That's my hammer.
Oh, wow.
I haven't got a metal one, so I've got a wooden one.
So because peasants didn't have their own weapons, they didn't own weapons?
No, no.
So everything's homemade, virtually?
Anything we use to fight with would be agricultural weapons. This is a flail.
That's very nasty.
Actually for getting the chaff from the wheat.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And whip it. I mean, imagine getting hit with that.
I'm just imagining it now, yeah.
This is a scythe. This is just for cutting wheat.
Yeah.
But as you can imagine, you could cut a log down with that
quite,
quite easily.
You could.
Sorry about that, Roy.
That's all right. I'm not a lord. I'm one of you. I'm a peasant. Actually, I feel really rude calling you a peasant. Is that what you were called?
Well, actually, in those days they were called simples. You had your nobility and your simples. Didn't necessarily mean they were simple. No. That's just the name that they had.
It's not a great name, is it?
No.